reducing vole damage on site, but I'll have to qualify that in a little bit. From a population biology aspect, again, these guys have one of the highest reproductive outputs and densities. Typically, a high vole density would be 50, 100, maybe 120 animals per hectare. The Townsend vole can get up to 800 voles per hectare, and in some studies they've recorded them up to 1,200 voles per hectare. A very high density in the best habitat, heavy grass field areas. On average, 350 to 650 voles would be a high year. The concern is we just don't know how often they reach those numbers, because that's generally when damage happens, is when the vole numbers get really high. They can breed every 21 to 24 days. Because of the mild winters on the coast, the Townsend vole can have anywhere from 10 to 11 litters possibly, compared to the interior guys you're looking at 4 or 5, and they can produce, say, 5 young per litter. So if you do the math, 5 young, 10 litters is 50 young times 500 per hectare. You're having a lot of young animals being produced throughout that season. And then the key is voles are territorial. They don't like a lot of their other voles in the same area. Those guys have to go somewhere. So that would be what, about 25,000 voles. And generally, if you have really good habitat around, those young are being kicked out into some other site. So even if you maintain a really good area without vegetation, or if it's low quality vole habitat, when things happen on the outside, generally they have to go somewhere, and then they come into these what we call suboptimal sites. There's no food for them to eat. They start damaging the crop trees, or in this case blueberries. But we're trying to figure out, when does this happen? Are there peaks in vole abundance? Have you noticed some years there's a lot of damage and other years there's no damage? Is that a general pattern, or do you have damage on a constant basis? So any thoughts on that? Because that's one thing we're trying to get a hold of. Typical voles in the interior habitat, they cycle every 3 to 5 years, so that's when the damage happens. But here, very few people have studied the Townsend vole. We're not sure if they cycle, or if the numbers are always high, or if they do have peaks, how often do those peaks happen? We are really working in a very deficient area of knowledge for these guys. So typically with vole populations, and generally with small mammals, they go through a couple periods of low abundance. Often in springtime they start off really low. They can build up, 4, 5, 10 times the number of voles by the time they get to October. They stop breeding. You have all this overwinter mortality. They start off again in the springtime, low abundance. They build up high. And then in some years you have very low abundance of voles. Other years you have very high abundance of voles. This is what we're trying to get a grasp. Because typically when you have these high periods every 3 to 5 years, this is the damaging period that we've noticed in forest plantations. We just don't quite understand what's happening with the Townsend vole in these agricultural sites. So when you walk through your plantation, if you start seeing some signs of voles, often you're going to see these little holes about an inch, inch and a half in diameter. And then you often see these runways going back and forth. There's another one on the outside curving around. There's another runway going off this way, and another runway going off this way. And then you can see the hole here through into the ground. The Townsend vole also burrows into the ground. If you notice all those holes going into your in the rows of the blueberries. This makes it a little more difficult to manage for. The interior guys, their cover is the vegetation, and their food is the vegetation. You herbicide that, or you burn it, get off the vegetation, you get rid of the cover and the food, and the voles don't come into the site. Here, you can get rid of the vegetation, they burrow underground, they still have cover, so then one of the concerns is, what do they eat? If you get rid of all the vegetation, are you almost inducing more damage? So that's something we're trying to get a handle on because it's such a different species. But one thing I want to point out is much of my discussions with many producers, when I ask them where the vole damage is, they generally point me into direction of these guys. And I'm sure you guys have these in your plantations as well. These are molehills, and a very different critter than the vole. Moles are insectivores. They're eating, this guy particularly is going to be focusing on earthworms. They're not causing any damage to the plantation at all. They're primarily eating just insects on the site, and arthropods and earthworms. And typically they burrow up eat the vegetation around, and in the process of coming back down, they fill in their holes with the dirt, and you get these little piles of dirt on your site, or you get what we call these long castings if it's under snow, and once the snow melts, you see these long tubes of dirt. So you're looking at a mole species, which is an insectivore rather than a vole. The voles is just those open 1.5 inch diameter holes, or those runways, are the classic sign of voles on your site. And in the worst case scenario, you look at this is not a blueberry plant, but it is a site just north of the border here in a planted area. The voles, because they burrow, they'll start debarking the trees just above the ground, or in this case for the Townsend vole, they'll start reducing the roots down to just little nubs. And I've seen a few plants where you can almost, and it was discussed here a little bit earlier, you can almost pick the plant up and it's just one solid nub, rather than quite an array of roots coming out. One other aspect of the damage is they do create a lot of tunneling through there, so they just go through making these little holes underneath the plant. We noticed in our operation that the tunneling doesn't seem to have any reduction in the amount of damage, or doesn't seem to have a lot of damage associated to the plant. It's just a lot of burrowing. So whether that causes any damage to the plant itself or reduces growth, we're not sure. So we started a monitoring project, and that is to address some of these uncertainties about vole damage. Why do some farms have high damage, other ones low? Is damage related to abundance? Does it only happen when there's high abundance of voles? Can we predict when these peaks happen, if they do in fact have peaks? And then what's the best method to reduce the vole damage? So we conducted 2 studies. One in the springtime, we went out and we probed the ground and we tried to identify how much vole activity and tunneling was happening, and was there any association between the abundance of water, abundance of vegetation, the number of holes and tunnels found on the site, and then the level of damage on those sites. The second study was in the fall, and we did some live trapping, trying to get an idea of the amount of, the number of individuals that are in these sites. So in general, 23% or a quarter of the plots had vole holes. You can see the holes in the ground, but the key was 83% of the 1,600 plots we put in, 83% of them had tunneling. So even if you don't see vole holes, there are active tunnels in the plantation. So the tunnels are not a good sign of whether there's vole activity on your site. There's a lot of vole activity potentially going on in absence of any holes coming out to the ground. And a majority of the fields had voles activity in there, but the damage was very low. We found that out of the 1,600 plots, only 105 plants had any susceptible damage by just tugging on it. If the roots were strong, we didn't look. If there wasn't much tunneling around there, but we only found 105 plants that actually could have had vole damage because they're very loose and there's lots of tunneling. And of those, only 37 plants actually had any damage. Even though 87 or 83% of the plots of the 1,600 had active vole tunneling, the damage was down to 2.2%. So there's very low damage, even though some voles were on the site. One thing we did notice is the number of tunnels increased with the amount of vegetation on the site. So overall, tunnels were very high, damage was low, and then there's a link between tunnels and vegetation. So then the second part of the study was the monitoring. We picked sites that had very low vegetation, medium vegetation, and very high vegetation, and we had 3 replicates of each, plus a control site, which is the ideal habitat. And then we were trying to get a handle on the vole abundance of these guys. Were the voles at this level, and that's why we didn't see damage? Or were they actually at this level, and they're just not eating the plants? And in general, after studying them from the deer mice, we have most of the animals, 150 plus animals, were primarily deer mice. We only caught 65 voles in the study last winter. The deer mice tend to stick to the low veg and medium veg. The voles primarily were found in high veg and the control sites, which were high vegetation as well. But we also did get a lot of other species on the site, in addition to voles and deer mice. So there's this neat pattern that deer mice preferred. 83% of the deer mice were found in the low veg sites, and about 83-85% of the voles were found in the high vegetated sites. So somehow they're separating it out. But again, there's that reinforced link between vegetation and abundance of voles on the site. So coming back to the, what are we looking at for the uncertainties? Why do some fields have low damage and other ones high? It's too early to tell because we only monitored those sites for 3 months last winter time. And we think during our monitoring period, the voles were actually at this low level because those numbers were only 1 or 2 animals caught per field. So definitely at the low level. Does that damage level increase when we get a lot more voles? Is there going to be more of a pattern between voles and vegetation when you start getting 10 times the number of voles on the site? It's something that we're going to be looking into. However, despite the most fields having vole sign and evidence, the damage was very low, less than 2%. So overall, it's too early to tell if voles have cyclic numbers annually or if they have cyclic numbers yearly. Do they go into every 3 or 4 year peaks or not? This is something we're hoping to get handled because we've just started up the study again, and it's now going to be a 5-year study trying to capture some of these peaks and valleys in the abundance to see is there any difference in the level of damage relative to the vole abundance at that time. So the data so far, I want to emphasize, is only a pilot study. It could change dramatically once the vole numbers start increasing to higher abundance. And then just some thank yous to primarily to the BC Blueberry Council and Karina for linking me up with the voles and being a primary motivator to getting the vole study going, along with Mark Sweeney from the Ministry of Agriculture being a secondary primary motivator to get the study going to see what's happening on those sites. And then this year's study is being funded by the Washington Blueberry Commission as well as the BC Blueberry Council. Is there any questions? I know that was fast.
One quick one, Kevin.
Yeah. What's that?
So if there's a field where we got tunnels, is there any value to going through with a paratiller and trying to collapse these?
Most of the tunnels that we found are not between the rows, they're right underneath the blueberry bushes. So,
right, well this goes under the row and lifts them up and drops it back down.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how deep the tunneling goes. Our probes, we only went in about 12 inches. I'm not sure how further down they go if you'll get them. Disrupting the tunnels, I think, definitely would. I think these tunnels are being used for multiple generations. So counting tunnels, they could be there, but the vole numbers could be low, but when they come up, they get used. Anything that would make it more difficult, but someone should do the monitoring to say, do they come back relatively fast, or do you actually keep them out of the area for some time?
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Let's take Doug. Okay, just a quick announcement before we get to our last speaker. Again, lanyards stay here.